what we do in Doubters Club is a lot of times we'll say, hey, because again, it's modeling friendship and pursuing truth together. So we would say, like, would you mind if I ask you a question about this? And so I will do that to you, Gaia. Would you mind if I ask you questions about your story?
Sure.
Is that okay?
You can ask questions.
Okay. If you said no, it would make for a really short podcast.
I was going to say,
sure.
if she says no at this point, I'm not sure what happens next.
Oh, I don't know.
I have a few questions of my own.
Well, hello and welcome along to today's edition of the show. If you're watching here on YouTube, do make sure to like today's video and subscribe to the channel if you want more of these conversations. And you can find more conversations on our Unbelievable podcast, and you can follow along with the show via our newsletter. You can even support us as well. All the links are with today's show in the info. Today on the show, we're asking, can a doubter find a place in church? My guests are Preston Ulmer and Gaia McDermott. The Doubters Club is a new book by Preston Ulmer that tells the story of the initiative he began to create good faith conversations with skeptics, atheists, and the spiritually wounded. Today, Preston will be in conversation with a doubter and a skeptic, someone who maybe has even been spiritually wounded along the way, Gaia McDermott. Gaia rejected the Christian faith she grew up in, but has been exploring church again as an adult, and she tells her listeners all about it on the podcast she hosts, Face the Sun. So far, Gaia remains a skeptic, but she's here to talk to Preston about her journey and to ask, can a doubter like me find a place in the church? So, Gaia and Preston, welcome along to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, well, it's great to meet you both. Gaia, we go back a long way. I think you've been listening to Unbelievable for a few years now. Preston, your first time on the show. Glad to have you here. We'll start with you, Preston. Tell us your story first and how the Doubters Club began.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Justin. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. My story, it involves a lot of skepticism, a lot of doubt, but I did grow up in a home that we would go to church, and it would be an evangelical Christian household. And then I became an atheist in Bible college, which is, I thought was rare and uncommon, but the more I travel and speak to people in Bible college and that graduate Bible college, it's not all that rare. And I started experiencing a lot of questions really about my sophomore year. And I would say, some of those questions were just basic questions, how you're going to interpret Scripture, things that you would think would come up. But it snowballed. And I had some well-meaning, but they just get well-meaning Pentecostal pastors that gave me really bad advice. Okay, so I put this in the book, but they told me sleep on the Bible. Like osmosis, just put your head on the Word of God, get this in your head, and that didn't work. I don't know if it's the translation I used or what, but it doesn't work. And then they told me listen to more worship music, and all these things that people were just kind of scared of the questions. And what I realized was that it wasn't just my questions; it was where I was starting to land with my answers. So I think that. Looking back, I see my story as people say the church is a safe place to wrestle with faith, but it's not always a safe place to land at a different answer. And if that's not the case, then it's actually not a safe place to wrestle with faith. And so I left the faith. I didn't want anything to do with really Christianity or Christians at that point. And it was someone who came to me and said, I don't care where you land as long as you're honest. Professor of philosophy and apologetics, and he genuinely wasn't. I'd say this, but he wasn't concerned whether I quote unquote converted or not. He just wanted me to be honest along the journey. And so, long story short, it took a while, but I just started to become convinced that Jesus did rise from the grave. That was kind of, everything else just didn't matter to me. That was foundational, and I didn't even know that was foundational until I started asking those sorts of questions. What it came down to for me was, if God exists, what type of God would that be? And how has he revealed himself, if he ever has? And those sort of questions. So then whenever you fast forward, I get married, and I continue education. I say it's for my own sanity. It wasn't for degrees on a wall. I just needed to stay sane, and so I kept pursuing education. And then we decided we wanted to go to Denver, Colorado to start a faith community. And I walk into a coffee shop, and I ask a coffee shop owner, really a stupid question in the urban center of Denver, right? And I said, "Hey, what kind of church do you go to?" And, and to assume anyone goes to church in Denver is silly. But I asked him that, and he just laughed. He said, "I'm an atheist. I don't go to church." And I said, I used to be an atheist. I used to not believe in all this either. And I said, "But if you did go to church, what kind of church would you go to?" And he's like, "No, I don't go to church." And I remember telling him, "I will buy more coffee from you if you'll just answer the question." And he said, "I would go to a church." Or he actually said this: "I would go to a place, not a church, that would allow me to ask questions and doesn't judge me for thinking differently." So I'm leaving that. He's the coffee shop owner. I'm leaving there, and he said, "What's your name?" I said, "Preston." And he said, "Are you going to start a church in this neighborhood?" And I said, "I don't know." And that's when he said, "If it's that kind of place, I think that you should." So we went back there months later, and I said, "Hey, I have an idea. What if you an atheist and me a Christian, what if we were to start conversations and just show our friendship and just we get to know each other more, and I'm not interested in having you think like me, but I just want to know what's true. And if I'm wrong," I remember telling him, "If I'm wrong, I moved my whole family to Denver, Colorado for this. I would want to know that I'm wrong." And he said, "Hey, if I'm wrong, I'd want to know it too." So that's kind of the origin story of the Doubters Club. I will fully admit I have a bias towards that sort of journey of holding ground for people and assuming that they have integrity along the way. And so I don't call it an evangelism technique or anything like that. I mean, it is a club. And now we have, a ton of Doubters Clubs that have started around the world. But it is, to this day, my favorite place where you have a Christian and a non-Christian who are co-moderating conversation, and they're modeling friendship with one another.
Well, I think what attracted me when I received the book was that it sounded a lot like what we've been trying to do on Unbelievable for a number of years. And how long has the Doubters Club been functioning as an organisation in that sense, Preston?
About 5 years.
Great.
Doubters Club's been going on about 5 years now.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really looking forward to getting into this conversation because, in a way, we're kind of doing on a public footing what you do personally with people all the time, I'm sure, in terms of having these kinds of conversations. But let's meet Gaia. Gaia, welcome to the show. So tell us a bit of your own journey up to this point, Gaia, because you're now hosting this podcast where you've been trying out places of worship, seeing what you think of it. But what took you to that place? Because I know you've had a rocky sort of relationship with Christianity up to this point.
Yeah, my background is that I was raised in Christianity. I went to Catholic schools and churches when I was a child up to 19. And then I started to go to Protestant churches in my 20s. And when I was in the Catholic Church, one of the things that I got caught up on was the rules. They got really confusing, and there's not long enough time in this podcast to go over all the rules that got so confusing. But one of them that caught my attention was, I remember being taught that if you missed Mass, that you would have to confess the sin of missing Mass. And if you didn't confess that sin, you couldn't receive communion until you had. So I began to think about how as I got older, realizing that those who were divorced couldn't receive communion, and those who were pro-choice or who supported death with dignity for those who had terminal illnesses couldn't receive communion. I got to wonder who the heck was going to get to receive communion at some stage. And I was also really appalled that this was a mechanism to control people. There's also so many other rules that controlled. So I just felt like I just can't do this anymore. And I went to Protestant churches, and I found that there was other unique, rules and hoops to jump through. And I found them both to be on the same playing field on things socially that I was not agreeing to. So in it, I started to think, what if all of this isn't true? And I am just going on with my life following this way, and none of it's true. Just like all the other religions that you would look at and think, well, that's absurd, that's odd, who would ever believe that? And then thinking, gosh, who would ever believe what I'm believing? So one of the things that I did, one of my earliest books that I read back in my later 20s was Bible Prophecy, Failure or Fulfillment by Tim Callahan. And that book criticized Josh McDowell's book, Evidence Demands a Verdict. And I had memorized that book. I had memorized Evidence Demands a Verdict, highlighted it. I was like ready to give a defense, right? Because that's what I was taught in the Protestant churches, was to be ready to give a defense. And in reading this book, Bible Prophecy, Failure or Fulfillment, it got me to start questioning everything that I had been building myself up to. And I started reading, who wrote the Gospels and different other books that would give me more understanding. And I guess over that time, I just realized that this wasn't true, and I had walked away from it. It's not an easy thing to do. It takes a little while to get to move away, but I was able to move away and kind of change my perspective on things. So essentially what I'd said to Preston when we had talked, and I think, Justin, you're of the same ilk, is that I believe that things are all going to work out, in the end, because something that you say, Preston, too, in your book is you talk about love and you talk about truth. And I think that if that's what we're gunning for, if we're going for truth and we're going for love, it's just going to work out. And if there's a good God, then there's a good God, and that'll work itself out. And if there isn't a God, then I'll know when I die, I'll know as much as I knew before I was born, which is nothing. So, yeah.
I'm just interested, Gaia, do you ever give yourself a label? Do you call yourself an atheist, an agnostic, an ex-evangelical? Is there anything you would go by?
Yeah, I didn't hear the term ex-evangelical until I got myself on TikTok, and I was like, wow, look at this.
They're everywhere on TikTok.
And there's no support back, then 20 plus years ago when I left. There's none of this, no internet, no nothing. But I think I called myself spiritual when I first started to leave. And I was really interested in female spirituality. And then I got to realize that because spirituality for me in Catholicism and in Protestantism was that God the Father, male, God the Son, male, the Holy Spirit is assumed male, and all the male stuff in the Bible, all the atrocities of the men to women, and that I felt that people just shrugged those things off. So, yeah, I would have called myself spiritual, and then I would have called myself agnostic, and then now I would call myself atheist.
Okay. So what's led you to want to sort of dip your toe back in by visiting these places of worship that you've gone on this interesting journey and tell your listeners about on your podcast? What's led you to even want to bother, I suppose, continuing to engage with the Christian world to the extent that you have?
I don't think I ever left that. I think I'm very, very curious, and I want to know more about psychology and sociology and people and others. So I've never kind of left it. When my son was little, I would drive past churches and think, oh, let's go in there. And he'd be like, oh, he would hate it. But so I would, I really wanted community. That is very big. And I mentioned that a great deal on my podcast. I don't know if I'm looking for a church or looking to become a Christian, go back to that. But I am looking to see how we can meld communities with different viewpoints. And then what...
Great. Well, so sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, what I was just going to say, Justin, is that I think that you were at some level a catalyst for my podcast. So yeah, because you're having Christian and atheist on and me listening to you, it was just exciting to see that kind of respect that you show to each other. And that got me to kind of think about how I'd like to pull that in and have conversations with others as well.
Great. Yeah, well, I've really enjoyed the episodes that I've been able to listen to of the Face the Sun podcast that you run,
Thanks.
Gaia. So thank you for it. And Preston, I mean, this is, I suppose Gaia maybe represents a lot of other people, but everyone's unique.
Yeah.
You've come to have conversations with, but is Guy's story, do you feel that, do you meet that among the people you interact with at the Doubters Club?
Well, Gaia and I got to talk yesterday on the phone, and what's neat about it is there's a point where we said, you know what, let's save those questions for tomorrow for the discussion.
I'm glad you didn't have the whole conversation before the show.
Oh no, not at all. No, it was just it was a great conversation though. And you know what I've realized, Justin, and is that Gaia, your story is unique because it's your story. And it doesn't, even the stats behind, how many people that leave Christianity based on leadership abuse, spiritual hurt, spiritual woundedness, all those statistics sometimes are helpful, but not all the time, because it's wrapped up in story. We're talking about personal, not just dilemmas, but disruptions and disorientations. And so the fact that you still have a curiosity about you, Gaia, is fascinating and very helpful. So a lot of times in Doubters Club settings, you're right, Justin, we do have people that would say, I grew up in Catholic church, or I grew up in Protestant home or evangelical, and I've since left. I would say, if I had to put a stat to it, it's well over 90% of people who would say that that's their upbringing. A lot of times the reason people don't go to church is because they've gone to a church before, okay? And so that's common. What's so unique, though, is like the pieces, Gaia, where you said the rules. When you talked about Mass, when you went to a Protestant church, there's more rules and regulations, but yet you do have this hunger for love and for truth, and that what I heard you say, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, is if there is a God, it would be the personification of both of those things. Am I right in saying that? Am I right in saying that if there is one, that you're making an assumption that would be the type of God that would exist? If
there's a good God, then everything should work out. If there's a good God, even if that means God looks at me and says, sorry, it's hell, that it's like, well, that's a bummer. But if there's a good God, then you'd have to say that God was making a good decision, even if I wouldn't agree with it or like it. But yeah, I believe that if there's a good God, things will be fine. And I don't believe there is one. And therefore, I will know as much as I knew before I was born.
So what we do in Doubters Club is a lot of times we'll say, hey, because again, it's modeling friendship and pursuing truth together. So we would say, like, would you mind if I ask you a question about this? And so I will do that to you, Guy. Would you mind if I ask you questions about your story?
Sure.
Is that okay?
You can ask questions.
Okay. If you said no, it would make for a really short podcast.
I was going to say, if she says no at this point, I'm not sure what happens next.
Oh, I don't know.
I have a few questions of my own.
Well, I was going to say, before you ask those questions, Preston, it might be helpful just to clue people a bit in what you're talking about there. Obviously, you run the Doubters Club with some specific caveats and ways of doing things. Do you want to just give us the essential principles of what makes for you for these good faith conversations? And then obviously we'll try to model them as we go along.
Yeah, so we do say Doubters Club is, look, we get people ask all the time, what's the actual agenda? And I'm like, Christians have done a really poor job at just having gatherings with people without agendas. Okay. But we don't have ulterior motives. Our aim is model friendship with people who don't think like you and pursue truth with one another. That's the aim. That's what we're going for in every Doubters Club. Doubters Clubs, they can never take place in a church. They have to be co-moderated between a Christian and a non-Christian, two people that would think differently than one another. And in doing so, they're going to model that friendship and they're going to pursue truth together. There actually has to be a friendship there. There has to be a relationship there. So when people call or email and say, hey, I would like to start Doubters Club, one of the first questions, we have a 5-question survey. One of the first questions is, tell us about a person in your life that you have a good standing relationship with that doesn't think like you. And when they say, I don't have a person like that, then it's like, hey, we would be happy to help you live that sort of lifestyle, but let's push starting a Doubters Club way back, the timeline of it. And we go through rules. We do have rules. Gaia, they're not rules like the church, okay, but they're very different rules. We value respect above being right. We listen without interrupting. We call it a safe place. We understand and accept differences of opinion. We just go through these rules. They're very important. And a lot of times, Justin, we will point, they're on a chalkboard. We'll point to the chalkboard and say, hey, don't forget rule number 3. Don't forget rule number 2. I did have a guy walk in one time who said, if I had known these rules, I wouldn't be on my 4th marriage.
I mean, to that extent, it's called the Doubters Club rather than the Debaters Club. I'm assuming this isn't a place just to have a big argument. It's actually about trying to develop genuine, authentic relationships and so on.
That's right. Absolutely. And so that's kind of a rundown of what a Doubters Club is. We don't open with prayer, we don't close in prayer, and we don't bring a sacred text. It's not a Christian gathering. I mean, I've had people from the Christian community that have said, hey, is it concerning to you, and this would be from a certain type of brand of Christianity, is it concerning to you that you have people in leadership in the Doubters Club that are living together and they're not married? And I'd say, we have atheists in leadership in the Doubters Club. It's a club. It's actually not. Now, of course, I'm a Christian. I love the church, but I do make the separation pretty clear in my mind. Doubters Club is not the church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's all really helpful background knowledge to help people get a sense of how these conversations are done, the nature of it. So please do go ahead, ask those questions that you were going to ask Gaia about earlier, and then we'll come to your questions as well shortly, Gaia.
Oh, sure. And I'm fascinated in, it seems like, the buzzword right now on TikTok, Gaia. I'm not on TikTok, and I have young girls, and I'm like, please don't ever get on TikTok. But you are stewarding TikTok well. The buzzword there on Instagram is deconstruction. Right. Mm-hmm. A lot of people saying they're deconstructionists. It seems like you went through a phase of deconstruction, but you still use those tools. You have a curiosity about you that honestly I wish Christians would still have about God. I know your curiosity would maybe land in more of like a psychological, social arena, but there's something about that. You didn't just deconstruct and then say, this is who I am. It sounds like you're still deconstructing. Tell me about what's caused you to stay curious.
That's just my brand of who I am and how I've been. I remember being in Catholic Church when they would tell you what communion was, that it was the body and blood of Christ, and I was like, so we're eating flesh, and they're like, no. So it's just the way I am, to stay curious. And, this deconstruction word, I never heard that either. It was such a lonely process 20, 25 years ago. And to see people having a community on deconstruction and seeing Christians get upset about the deconstructing. It's like, why would you be upset about people trying to find the truth? But yeah, so I'm just a curious person by nature, I would say.
And is there anything that you're saying, like, I'm more certain than I am curious on that topic whenever it comes to spirituality in general?
I'm certain there's no God. I know that.
Okay. So that's a place, and what drove that certainty home to you during your journey?
I've done a lot of studies. It became to study the birth of Jesus and realizing some hiccups there in regards to the census and other things. It just goes on to a lot of different apologetic type conversation, and then also studying the resurrection. That's the one I'm hot on. I like Bart Ehrman is fantastic. I know you've had him on, Justin, for a debate here, and I've done an episode on the resurrection, and we did a debate discussion. We don't have debates on my podcast either, but the resurrection was really seeing all the concerns there stopped me in my tracks. And it's a nice way to bring it to any Christian, because that's, and you can pull that apart, the gig is up, right? The buck stops here. If Jesus didn't rise, we're done. So it's a great way to focus, because there's so many issues there, rather than taking, evolution and this and that and the other. It's like, well, did the resurrection happen or not? Let's talk about it. And then we can wrap things up if I can pull things apart in that regard. So the studies of things that helped me understand was it was hard to refute. To be honest, Preston, it was really hard to refute some of those things. And then when I think of it, when people say that they're doubters, I think well, you should doubt. Your God is invisible. Mm-hmm. Your God is invisible, and you can't see him, you can't touch him, you can't hear him. And people say, well, I heard God. And it's always that, the fluffy version. It's not the, somebody really speaking into their ears. So it was just all of the above kind of thing.
It's really helpful in understanding your story too, that, it's not just out of this, this disorientation from the church, but you're like, and then I put in the study. And the fascinating thing, Gaia, is the thing that you said, I'm not satisfied with the answers. I go, that might be the only thing I'm satisfied with, is the answer about the resurrection. And that's why, Justin, for me, when we talk Doubters Club, I'm like, if Gaia lived closer, we'd be good friends, because there's a certain point where I'm not going to convince her of things that she's already studied, but the community and the relationship, and how can we help our city? How can we help each other? And is there truth to be found that I haven't found or that Gaia hasn't found? I would rather do that together than to go find it, bring it back to her. And I think historically, probably in the last 50 years, we've been worse about it, but Christians have gone and got the truth and then brought it back and said, hey, here's the feast, and then atheists or agnostics, they go, that I'm allergic to that. That's not actually what I'm after. So thanks for telling me that, Gaia. Obviously I'll have more questions, but I want to open up to you if there's a question you have.
Well, before we pass it to Gaia, we're just going to take a quick break and we'll be back. We're having a conversation on doubt today. Can a doubter find a place in church? Gaia McDermott has started a podcast in which she explores churches, places of worship, as a skeptic, as an atheist, but she's interested, she's curious, she says, and she's in conversation today with Preston Ulmer, who's the author of The Doubters Club. He's founded Doubters Clubs all over the USA, and we'll be continuing their conversation very shortly. Have you ever found yourself tongue-tied when someone asks you, is there evidence for God? What about suffering? Did Jesus really rise from the dead? I'd like to introduce you to Confident Christianity, our online apologetics course. Featuring video training from world-renowned thinkers such as William Lane Craig, John Lennox, Amy Orr Ewing and Gary Habermas, you'll learn how to understand, defend and share your faith with confidence. I'll also share lessons I've learned from over 15 years of hosting atheists and Christians in dialogue. You can enrol now at premier.org.uk/course or click the link with this video. Welcome back to today's edition of the show. We're talking about doubt. The Doubters Club is a new book by Preston Ulmer. It tells the story of a new initiative he began to bring good faith conversations between skeptics, atheists and the spiritually wounded. It's almost like doing on the ground what we've been trying to do with Unbelievable over the years. But Gaia is our other guest today, Gaia McDermott, who's the host of the Face the Sun podcast. Belief and Unbelief, Religion and Unbelief is the strapline of the podcast. There are links, by the way, to both of my guests from today's show. So Gaia, we were hearing your story of why you've rejected faith. You call yourself an atheist now. You came to have doubts and then rejected really entirely the foundation of the Christian faith. And your belief in God went as well at the same time. You say at the end of the day, God is invisible. I mean, obviously, there are philosophical arguments out there. We've heard some of them probably, the existence of God and so on. But even someone like Bart Ehrman, I don't think calls himself an atheist. I think he's more of an agnostic at this point as far as his beliefs about God go. He doesn't believe in the resurrection, obviously. But so do you feel like that's a closed door to you? Is there anything that could or would make you reconsider? Is there any, if it could be cracked open again, a fraction, what might it look like, do you think?
Yeah, I'd say that there's never a closed door for me, and that, when I was a Christian, it wasn't closed apparently for me to become an atheist. But as an atheist, I don't think that when I say that that's the only truth. So I'm trying to understand what truth is, and you believe what you can believe, and what you believe is true. Otherwise, you'd be believing something else, and you just kind of try your best. So it's definitely not a closed door for me.
Okay. And when you do go into church, what you say you're looking for community, is that it, or do you find when you do you enjoy any of the things that normally happen in church, like praying and singing and that kind of thing?
Not so much. So when I go to, I have a vision of what I think some things could change in churches. So no, worship is awful. The singing is really rough for me. And there's a lot of things that are difficult. If you listen to some of the episodes, there was a few that I enjoyed, and I took something away. And once I started to go to, actually, the last 3 churches I went to were what I would call rainbow churches. And those were very pleasant. I did go to some other ones that were conservative, that were surprisingly nice to go to as well. Yeah. So my future, or what I'd like to see, I think when I look back at Andy Stanley wrote a book, Deep and Wide, and he really does talk to people who, wants to bring in people who don't believe necessarily. And what he said was when drums were brought in, that was unusual, electric guitars. Now it's light shows and smoke machines. And I do think that churches have a deep opportunity to change. And I would say that if they kept the singing part fast and the talking part fast, this message part fast, and I think that there's opportunity, because I really want community. I don't want Christianity, but I want community, and there's plenty of places to get it. But what I think that there should be more interactive with learning how to listen, learning how to question. I do a lot of work with street epistemology, and I try to learn how to do questioning. And what I'll do is I'll watch it on YouTube and I'll pause it and think, I wonder what the question will be next, and I'll prepare myself. I think there's workshops that churches could do to create better questioning, because there's a gentleman named, I forget his first name, his last name is Hayward, and he's also called the Naked Pastor, which I love his name. And okay.
Instagram account.
Yeah, I just learned of him not too long ago, and he wrote a book called Questions Are the Answers. And that's what I believe, is that we're not asking enough questions and we're not listening. I mean, Christians will ask questions like, why? And you put you against a wall. But they're not very good at street epistemology because they always want to tell you. They want to tell you, they don't want to listen.
Sure. And I get the sense, in that sense, that what you don't like about church is the bits where it's basically a top-down, the person preaching, the music kind of being sung at you. You like the bit where everybody has a say, where everyone gets together and so on. So it sounds like, you'd love the Doubters Club in that sense. Preston, what are your thoughts on some of these reactions that Gaia has to the churches when she goes into them? And feel free to comment also on her sense that she's open, but she's not sure what that would look like if she were to come back to anything resembling some kind of faith.
Well, first I'll say there are still churches, Gaia, that I go to that I'm like, the singing's terrible and the preaching's terrible. And Justin has experienced those too. I actually just did an interview with the Naked Pastor, the guy that you were just talking about. And in talking to him, this is probably about a month and a half ago, in talking to him, I asked him, about his journey and such. And, he would be different in that he is open to believing that Jesus would be the ultimate image of God. Now, how he would interpret Jesus would be different than mainstream evangelical thought for sure. But he gives this analogy, Gaia, that he says his journey has been like de-weeding a garden, that it is continual. He is trying to reveal something that I'll go back to that you said, like love and truth. He's trying to preserve a garden. And in that way, he does not stop doubting, and he doesn't stop deconstructing. So I would be curious in your life, to go back to this person that you and I both know. In your life, is there anything that you're like, that is the most precious thing to me? That for Christians it would be belief in God, it would be the resurrection, and they're constantly defending that. For you, is there anything that you're like that? Is it community? Is it authentic community? Is it a certain type of community? I would just be curious what it is for you that you're like, I'm constantly wanting to protect that.
Probably all the things that, like, one of the things I would call myself is a humanist, and I think all the things that humans would value, that we value each other, that we value life, love, laughter, good food, wine. I don't know. There's a lot of things to value, but certainly friendship and depth of relationship, I think, is important to me.
Uh-huh. And on your view of people who are religious or Christians, do you feel like they tend to have that same value, or in your experience, do they not have that same value?
Ooh, well, after the past 5-6 years of what I would call this Trumpism, which I think has damaged your side of the aisle, Preston, that I'm not sure always how. And I'm trying to use different words when I say Christians. I used to say it was almost like a swear word to me, but it's instead to think about people as maybe evangelical or Christian. And so the evangelical side or fundamentalist side, that has become more and more what I think is pretty hateful and angry and bitter. I think that there's a reason why in the 1990s that we were looking at only 5% being nuns, and now we're looking at 35% in our country being nuns. I think after Trump and the pandemic, you all are going to get a really great opportunity to find out how that hate and bitterness worked out, for you all. So I don't know if I would necessarily equate Christianity with the things that I value.
It's interesting because the things you said you value, even good wine, I feel like Jesus valued. And I do, in all seriousness, I do wonder, and this would be in a form of a question, Gaia, I do wonder if Christians were to go back to their roots in that way, if the church, or if you found a community, let's just say a local community that you're like, they went back to their root, this is the Jesus way, high love for neighbor, that it outweighs any sort of self-indulgence that you'd find in capitalism or anything like that would probably be some critiques from other people of the church. If you found a community like that, would that be a piece of evidence for you that maybe there is something here? Or would it be like, what would that experience be like for you?
So I think my question back to you, Preston, would be, how would that come to being? How would the church get back to its roots? Yeah.
Wow, that is a question. I wish that there's so many people that I feel like are trying to get back to the roots, and I think a way, I also just talked with Dr. David Gushee, who wrote After Evangelicalism. I think that's the title of his new book. And he talks about this, Gaia, where he says a way to go back, like after evangelicalism. So he would be, someone that would say he's a Christian, but he's not going to be evangelical Christian. And he would probably be someone that would say that the way forward is starting new faith communities. The way forward would be from a grassroots approach. The way forward would be personal responsibility. It's not Sunday centric. It's the things that you said you don't like about the Sunday experience. Whenever we're talking about a Christian church of worship and the singing and the preaching, it's going to be not centered around those things. It's going to be centered around how you treat your neighbor. It's going to be centered around how you have a self-awareness of your own story and what you've done with that story. It's going to be how you use your money. There's going to be so much personal responsibility on that I think that would be a change. I think that's a way forward. That's what interested us in starting a church in the first place, was asking the same question that you just asked of what would it look like to go back to our roots, the Jesus way. Because I think you and I are both intrigued by that way, whether you say Jesus existed or he rose from the grave, and you set that aside. But the ways of Jesus are intriguing. I think it's going to take that as a personal responsibility, not a personal salvation in saying that how do we get everyone to believe the way we believe, but how is this working out in my life, in the way I spend my money, in the way I love people, in how I stop judging people. All those things I think are going to be really important. And so that's what I'm curious around. If you experienced that, does that change anything for you? Or is that just a sigh of relief, like I finally have that community?
Well, I thought something that you said there, Preston, was interesting. So when you talk about, I think that several things. So one of them is I'd love to see Christians being possibly just staying into the Matthew, Mark, Luke, John circle. I said that on my last podcast that I don't know what the rush is to read the Bible in a year. Just maybe stay in the Jesus part, because I think that they lose it. I think they start going off on some other rules and things. And
we just feel better about ourselves when we read it in a year. I don't know why. It's peculiar.
So what I also noticed that you said the word judging. So how do we start judging? And one of the things that I think would be helpful, it goes back to David Hayward on the questions are the answers. I think one of the things that helps us humans, so Christians and everybody else, is that if we're not judging and we ask questions. And one of the things I thought of was the story that you told about Travis, the gentleman who there were people who had judgment of him that he was living with his fiancée. And I think that there's an opportunity there to ask questions. So when they were judging, I think an opportunity when they were saying, well, what will other people think and what message does that send, that this person is in leadership? And I think it's an opportunity to turn and ask questions of, well, what do you think the message is? And what do you think? Do you think that there's anybody else in the church, of the pastor, that do you think people judge him? How should we handle that? But I think that if we make people do the work, that we're going to have either an exceptionally great conversation or at least a good one, or we're going to rope-a-dope them by questions and we'll tire them out and we don't have to get into these arguments, that we can kind of do like a master swaying from the judgment bullets that are coming. If you ask questions, you can just wear them out, or you can at least get a great conversation.
Well, I'm just interested in stepping in here just a little bit to ask, Preston, there's this interesting sort of thing going on here where most churches that I know would say that they want to be open to people. They want to be open to them with their questions even. Now, I'm sure there are some churches better at doing that than others. But there's also that point at which a church also very often will say, but we do hold some things to be true, or there are some kinds of specifics about how we believe the Christian life is to be lived. And that may involve saying, for instance, well, we do believe that there's a particular view of marriage that we hold to be central, and that if you call yourself a follower of Christ, if you want to be, let's say, a member of this church, then you will need to abide by that. That may involve, some kind of issue around whether people live together before they're married, or may involve issues around homosexuality and everything else, which for Gaia has obviously, she's felt those rules have kind of been exclusive, and those are the things that she felt really turned her off church. Whereas I can see many church leaders say, well, we want to be open, but we also feel that in good conscience to be a follower of Christ in this place, ultimately this is the path in which you must ultimately walk. So how do you kind of balance that? Because I suppose at some point, even if we make space for doubters and their questions, many churches will nevertheless, there'll still be a point at which they'll say, but really,
sure,
then you need to be here at this point before you can join this club. It's not the doubters club, it's the Christian club. It's where we do have a rule for life about what is involved in saying that you are committing your life to following Jesus in this particular place. So how do you navigate all of that fact, I suppose? Yeah.
Well, it's very messy and complicated, and it's not unique to just Christian church. I mean, anytime that you're going to be, even the club, the Doubters Club, we say it's the least exclusive club in the world, but we still have rules, right? We still have rules. To date, we've only had to ask 2 people to leave in 5 years in all the locations. So, but we did have to ask them to leave. So I just want to first say it's not I mean, even if you do a book club, if you don't read the book and you keep coming to the book club and you're just eating all the free food, you might be asked to leave, right?
We all know that one person.
I know. And if someone's watching this and they're like, I don't know that, they're that person. Okay. But it's not that idea of the closer you get to it, the more in you become, the more you have to change your actions and your beliefs. That's not actually unique to the church. It's not. I think what's unique to the church would be whenever we make claims like, you're free to ask questions here. But then when people land at a different place, the way that they're ostracized, or the way that they're not received, or the way that they're trying to be controlled, don't post this on your social media. Well, why can't you post that? Well, because other people know that you go here, and if you put, and that's unique in some of the experiences probably that even Gaia has heard stories of, or maybe had herself. And so I think that that's unique. The control aspect of it is unique. Within the church too, Justin, the Sunday service, when we become so Sunday-centric, now we have rules: who can serve, who can't serve, who can run sound, who can't run sound, who can play the drums. And I see Gaia nodding her head. You know what I'm talking about. When we read the Gospels, and I'll include it into just the New Testament, okay? When we read the New Testament and the formation of a movement, there is this distinct aspect of it that they do worship together, but they're known by what they're doing in the community and in what they believe. But again, that's in what you believe and what you do. That's not unique in any club. I mean, that's part of it, right? To be in. But I think when we start drawing lines around who can worship on Sunday mornings, that becomes peculiar. And I'll give an example. I'll give an example that probably is going to resonate with a lot of your viewers. In my opinion, as I read the New Testament, I have landed at a place that I'm a pacifist. Okay, that I would say I don't believe it's okay to kill your enemies. If I were to just simplify it, because I follow Jesus, when he says love your enemies, that doesn't mean kill them. And in fact, I think the early church had some impulses that were correct in saying you got to lay down the Roman sword before you get baptized. I mean, there's just this tradition that we have of loving and caring for our enemies and not cutting their ears off, okay? So I think that's how and I feel like it's actually crystal clear. I have Christian brothers and sisters who strongly disagree with me, be it just war theory or whatever, right? Or that they just live in Missouri and they like their guns. They just disagree with me. And they do so on the basis of their interpretation of Scripture. Now, I think killing is a really big deal. But I will stand next to someone on a Sunday service and worship with them with two very different perspectives. That I'm going, I can't kill them. I don't even have a gun. And then you have someone else who, they're ready for someone to step foot on their lawn. And both claim to love Jesus. And in that situation, both are welcomed in and they're allowed to worship. But on a topic like sexuality, where there's a disagreement, again, the closer you get, there are beliefs and practices that become normative. That's normal. But we're talking Sunday worship services. It's peculiar to me when churches draw a line and say they can't worship because they think differently on sexuality than you do. And I'm like, wait a second, they think differently on killing people than I do. And they're welcomed in. And so I think that the peculiarity of probably Gaia's experiences and other people's experiences, to answer your question, is actually around that worship service. But we'd be fooling ourselves if we thought that the closer you get in, the more your beliefs and behaviors have to change. That's normal to any sort of organization.
What's your thoughts on that, Gaia?
I have a lot of thoughts on the marriage and with LGBTQ in the church and with abortion in the church, which I certainly did a series on abortion, because you can't even find really a verse in the Bible that is against abortion, and you can find some things that are kind of highlighting almost how to have one. There's some, but boy, do they really drill down hard on that and control it and want to control women, and it's a very complicated subject, So it's the control stuff on that, the control stuff on the marriage. It definitely got me to. There was the other half, which you talk about heart and head, Preston, in your book, and the heart stuff, the head stuff that we talked about with the Bart Ehrman resurrection and questions about the birth of Jesus and other things. So, but then on the heart stuff of the LGBTQ, women, race, after George Floyd was murdered, I listened to sermons around Connecticut, places I'd been, and they didn't even hardly touch on it, except for one church. And that gentleman is a conservative, and I will he has my ultimate loyalty, because he made sure he did a series on it in Wethersfield, and people just left. Some people had concerns about that, him talking about race. Right, so the control on the issues of race and women and LGBTQ are concerning. The control on volunteering, I'll say this, is that before my podcast, before I was doing the whole series of visiting places of worship, I visited one where they wouldn't let me volunteer to pour coffee. I mean, I was an atheist, so that wrapped that up. It's just really an uncomfortable place when it comes down to that.
Do you feel like, I mean, presumably, has the church ever stopped you going into their church because you're an atheist, Gaia? Or presumably, I'm guessing, no. I mean, that would seem to be counterproductive at some level for any church to stop people coming in. But obviously, there have been barriers when you've tried to move further than just simply attending the worship service. So you've wanted to volunteer, say, and they know that you don't have any beliefs, you're an atheist, maybe you disagree with them on issues around LGBT, whatever. And for me, Preston, I can imagine for a number of churches, most churches I know of would be perfectly happy for anyone like Gaia to come in and worship and just attend, essentially. But it is that point at which you move into having responsibilities, having there was a big hoo-ha a few years ago when Hillsong in New York, I think, someone who wanted to sing in the choir turned out to be in a gay relationship and was asked not to be involved and so on. And I think a lot of people say, hang on, what's the harm? What's the difference between doing that or simply attending the church? But obviously for some churches, there is a line, and different churches are going to draw it in different places as to what kind of level of commitment or expectation or belief even that they're expecting once you've kind of start to engage in a certain way in the church. And obviously for Gaia, she feels that's exclusionary. Would you defend a church doing that, or do you think the lines shouldn't be drawn where they're often drawn in churches, Preston?
I do have trouble with where the lines are drawn in a lot of areas, but it's more so from a place of they're not being consistent. So here, we have so many denominations for so many reasons, and there are different expressions of the love of God, and they call themselves the church. So it is actually possible, obviously, for Gaia to find the type of church that she's saying that's going to be championing and being an advocate for LGBTQ plus community, and that's going to, whenever it comes to topics of race, that they're going to speak out in a way that's going to make you feel comfortable. And then you're going to find people that are the church that are not part of that, and that, like you said, that they're going to be Trump. I forget the way that Trumpisms and all this stuff spewing from the pulpit, okay, and they're going to be politically driven. And what's interesting, Justin, is the ability Christians have to say, or that they have to participate in something like the hatred that Gaia had just said whenever it comes to supporting one political candidate. But then whenever they talk about loving a certain type of community, LGBTQI plus community, they get ostracized. And I think that there's a lack of consistency. So I do have an issue, not in the lines that churches draw, because I don't think there's a way around it. I actually think that you will find church communities that are going to be on all different sides, and there's not a way around that. The thing I have an issue with is the lack of consistency, that if you have someone who says, hey, that they're gay and they want to follow Jesus and they want to get baptized, that the church is going, nope, you got to change your behavior first. But then you have someone that's $200,000 in credit card debt and they want to get baptized, and they go, great, please make sure that you tithe on your paycheck. And it's like, well, wait a second. There is something about consumerism and debt that Jesus speaks to. And so those are the things that I have an issue with. The other things, and I know it sounds kind of flippant to say there's churches for everybody. I think that's a whole nother discussion of what type of church is a true church and what would I say is the historical expression of the church and all those sorts of things. But I'm saying on this one, on your question, do I have an issue where they draw the lines? I do, because it feels inconsistent. But in as much as that's true, that's a personal challenge to me as well, because I do attend a local church. I really like our local church. I think that the people on staff at our church are ecumenical. They don't think the same way. They're not ordained by one different denomination, and they think differently. They're reading different things. They have different discussions on this issue. They're going to have different opinions on the gay rights issue. But what we find is this centrality of a Jesus-looking God and a Jesus-looking people. And that's why I say I feel very comfortable there. But in the same way I say I feel comfortable there, there's other people that will not. And in Missouri, you have 1,000 churches that you can choose from. And so that would be my answer. I just think the lack of consistency. And to Gaia's point, it probably would. That's probably where she would want us to ask more questions, to be more consistent. And I would say in general, Christian or non-Christian, that's just the refining process of who we are. Yeah.
We're fast running out of time. We're nearly at the end of the second segment already, so we'll have another 10 minutes or so to start to wrap this conversation up. But we've been talking with Gaia McDermott and Preston Ulmer today. The Doubters Club is the new book by Preston, and Gaia is the host of the Face the Sun podcast. We'll be back in just a moment.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.
Well, you can find links to my guests from today's show with today's programme. The Doubters Club is at thedoubtersclub.com, and you can check out Gaia's podcast, Face the Sun, Religion, Belief and Unbelief. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts from. It's been really interesting having you both on the show today, because, I've been saying just in the break there, Gaia, to Preston, that we could have zeroed in on any of these issues that you've brought up, the resurrection, gay rights, abortion. We're not doing that today because we have plenty of shows where people can go and listen to good debates on those in the archive. But it's just what we're really talking about is for someone who has doubts, questions and so on, that may not sit easily in many Christian contexts in church. How do we accommodate that? How do we create a place where questions and doubts and so on can be heard and processed, and people don't feel like they're being excluded basically by just asking them and so on? But I think you had another question for Gaia, Preston, before we start to wrap the show up. Do you want to ask your question?
Sure, yeah. In the Doubters Club, we call this part your final thoughts. So we just, and then we all vote on a topic and we talk about it next time. But Guy, here's my question. First of all, thanks for sharing all of this, because I think, like I said at the beginning, your story makes it all unique, and it's an honor for me to be able to hear it. And one of the things that I heard you say was what I believe too. It's both a head and a heart thing. Anytime that we're trying to figure out what's the truth of any given topic, it's both that contribute. So here's my question. If you found a faith community that affirmed the heart issues, what does that do to the head part of it? What does that do to your spirituality or where you've landed at with God?
So since I am an atheist, I wouldn't go on the direction of spirituality or on the God platform. But if somebody was to answer the questions of the heart, what I am seeing in preparing for some of my podcasts before the pandemic, and I was visiting places, I wanted to go to a synagogue. And I remember looking on their website and my friends coming around me and gathering and seeing what they were doing. And I said, why isn't everybody Jewish? Because they had this great interactive community involvement. So that, along with the rainbow churches, that seemed to be one of the questions you asked very early on, Preston, was what can we do for our cities? Like if we live closer together, that's what we'd be kind of talking about. So that's what I'm kind of jazzed about, not necessarily going with their spirituality, although as far as I understand, synagogues will let you become a member, even if you're not Jewish. I went to the Quaker meeting house, and it seems that they have an atheist too who takes on leadership roles. So someplace that would be like that. I'm not sure if it would change my spirituality, but certainly I think we're changed when we're interacting with each other in a more deeper way.
Well, thanks for saying that. And I do know Christians, we're just not always, a lot of times we're just after changing someone's mind. And we've attached, salvation to that. And so we feel like the stakes are heavy and those sort of things. So I just say thanks for sharing all that. And if you're ever in the same city, we'll work.
Yeah, that's right. Hartford, Connecticut. So one of the things that you say, Preston, is, would people be willing to change their minds? And I think that's a question for you as well. That would you be willing? I mean, you say that you're an atheist. I'm not sure. It sounded like you were questioning in a different level. I've been an atheist for about 20, 25 years or out. And I'm wondering if you would change your mind to be an atheist, to leave the church.
Yeah, well, on that season of life, for me, it was, I wasn't convinced that there was a God. I wasn't convinced of Jesus. I wasn't convinced of any of those things. So when I make that claim, obviously it's very different than you being an atheist. But that would be part of my story. And yes, I would say I'm open to changing my mind. I feel like that I'm arriving at different places on different topics, and the thing that would change my mind would be if the resurrection wasn't true. And then I know that the follow-up question would be, would you ever be open to it not being true? And I would hope that I have total integrity in saying this, but yes, I'm open to that because I want to know what truth is. I have this one life, and I want to live it well, and I want to teach my daughters well. And I do want to kind of orient my life around the truth. So the answer is yes, I'd be open to changing my mind. And then the question of what would change your mind would be, a mutual question back and forth that I think would be of great interest.
How would you know that you were wrong, Preston? How would you know you were wrong?
Great question. History for me is a big deal. And, you're talking about Bart and how I think he went to school with Greg Boyd. I think they went to school together. I know they've done.
Know that.
Okay, well, maybe I'm wrong on that, but I know that they've talked often about each other.
I'm hearing about it if it is, but yeah, you may well be right.
So I know they talk often about each other. Greg Boyd is a friend of mine, and you have two people who talk about the resurrection with such veracity and like passion, and one doesn't believe it and one does believe it. So to answer that question, how would I know that I'm wrong? It would be for me, history is a really big deal. History, and I actually wouldn't hinge it on my personal experience. I wouldn't hinge it on, do I feel anything on Sundays? Do I feel anything when I pray? For me, it would be if we were sitting down and you were to say, okay, this is historically why I don't believe that. And if I find that to be more convincing than the history of why I do believe,
and have you read?
Which, by the way,
have you read Bart Ehrman? Have you read atheist books that bring out the history of Jesus and say it from giving a different understanding?
I've read not Bart, but I've read Dawkins and I've read Harris. I've read, I've read them, and for me, it's not as convincing. And that's the fascination of the discussion, is to say, for you, you'd say, of course it is. And I would say, well, and then I think we do start to get into the territory of personal story and personal narrative. But to be unconvinced, it would be history first for me.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we're not going to solve the resurrection within the wrap bands of this show, but we'll probably return to the resurrection when Easter comes up, planning to do a debate on that anyway. Look, it's been really interesting. I've got to ask this question, though, as we start to close this out, Preston. As I said earlier, we feel there's a lot of overlap between what you're doing with the Doubters Club and Unbelievable. I've always been interested in trying to host these kinds of conversations where you respect the other person, where you bring two perspectives together and we have a fruitful encounter. There's not necessarily a winner per se. It's just about hopefully exploring the truth together. Having said all that, I am a Christian, as you know, And to some extent, I do this because I do believe there's a God, and I do believe that God can use something like the Unbelievable Show to bring people to faith. Now, that doesn't always happen, and in fact some people say, actually, I listened and now I'm more convinced that there's not a God or Christianity is untrue. And in a sense, I'm not here to control what happens. I just believe though that ultimately when you present the honest opinions and truth and let people make up their mind, for me an outcome for that is that if someone became a follower of Jesus, I'd be very happy about that. Now, is the Doubters Club really as neutral as you say? Is there not a little bit of covert evangelism in there, I suppose, is the question I want to ask rather cheekily as we start to close this out?
Covert evangelism is a great term. We actually have atheists and Christians who go through the training. We just had a atheist, her name's Claire. She launched a Doubters Club on her college campus. And so I will say this, as a Christian, I do write about this to some degree in the book. Perhaps I should have wrote more, but I have an ultimate goal. I mean, innate to Christianity is this goal that we would populate heaven more, that increase the family of God, however you want to word that more and more people would know and love Jesus. So my ultimate goal, I would love to see that happen. I'm really fierce about getting rid of an ulterior goal, an ulterior motive, of saying, hey, you're here so that you think like this. And I think you're doing the same thing on Unbelievable, Justin, is that you're not saying we're doing this so that the world thinks like me. It's your ultimate motive, because you're a Christian, is your ultimate motive. It's just part of what it means to be Christian. And in the same way, Gaia, if you thought, and I don't know if you do, but if you thought religion is bad and you take that sort of brand of humanism and you're I mean, it would just be innate to that you might make it part of your ultimate goal is I want people to be free from that. It just happens that where you land, there's this ultimate motive, but I don't want an ulterior motive. So I don't actually, it's not the aim that we ever convert someone in a Doubters Club. And I'm not trying to say this is my co-moderator and then eventually they're going to become a Christian. That to me just feels like car salesman-y. I'm just not interested in that. And I will say this, there is a very selfish part of this that I have grown and I've been challenged. And even to Gaia's last question of what would change my mind, all the stuff that I just said, what I've learned about the way I'm wired, Gaia, is all of that would have to be with someone that I greatly trust. So when I add that in there, when I really trust someone and then they land at a different place, okay, well, then that does something to me. And so I like the idea of having these friendships and building trust and pursuing truth together. No ulterior motive. Ultimate motive, yes, I don't know how to get rid of that. I don't want to get rid of that. It's part of who I am. But I don't want to have a you're here so that mentality.
Yeah, I appreciate.
Well, if you're looking for community, Guy, it sounds like if there was a Doubters Club near you, you'd be the first in line.
Or you can start one in Connecticut. Shameless plug.
There's none in Connecticut, huh? There's none in Connecticut.
No.
We're pretty.
No, I can double check.
So I do say
Yeah.
I do notice that Christians really do try to do the whole populate heaven or win people to Jesus or condemn people, and the whole you don't get to do that. You don't get to condemn me, and you don't get to save me or win my soul. That's God. If you really do believe that there's a powerful God, I do sometimes question if Christians even think there's a powerful God, because if there should be enough power to do this, right? So if there's power to do that, and as far as converting, I don't try to convert anybody to atheism necessarily. I just do me, and that's what I think you do, Justin, too. And I'll never forget one of our earlier chats, and as you saying, if somebody was to, people leave, things will work out, So I'm not trying to convert as well, but if you want to come over to my side, you're more than welcome to. I would rejoice. I would rejoice.
Wow. Well, there
So
will be
funny.
rejoicing in the atheist version of heaven if Justin Brierley comes across. I mean, in all seriousness, though, Guy, I have appreciated this conversation because this is real life. these are the real questions that real people who are involved in real conversations have. And I appreciate both of you and the honesty you've brought to this conversation. So thank you very much. Really, really interesting conversation today. Do go and check out the resources that we've already talked about. The Doubters Club is the new book by Preston. Gaia has a podcast called Face the Sun. There are links to both of those from today's show. For the moment, Gaia and Preston, thanks for being with me on Unbelievable.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.